Hello, this is the third lecture on Kant, and we're going to be going over the second section of the grounding for the metaphysics of morals. Um, this is where Kant is going to get a little bit more difficult. And again, we are a little bit behind for the week. I do apologize. It's been a very busy week for me. I'm sure that it's been a busy week for you. The compressed schedule of the summer session, trying to fit everything into 8 weeks, certainly is a challenge. But we persevere and go on with Kant. I want to remind you that last time Kant started with the concept of the goodwill. And this brought him to the concept of duty. So to act in accordance with duty is acting in accordance with the goodwill. And the goodwill is the only thing that we know to be good because it's good in itself. It's not something that is good for another purpose, but is good in itself. And Kant had a discussion of duty, and he was asking the question of how do we know if we're acting from duty or if we're acting according to inclination, right? Because if we're acting according to inclination, our activity doesn't have moral worth. It only has moral worth if we're acting in accordance with duty, because that's what the goodwill is, the only good thing, right? And so he had this quandary, and his answer to this quandary was to act in accordance with the law. So the law then will tell us if we're acting according to inclination or if we're acting in accordance with duty. But he wanted to further develop that point that the law for him really couldn't be something that was dependent upon an expected circumstance or dependent upon anything that's expected in the world, right? Because then it was contingent. So for the law, he had to rely only on the concept of law in itself, right? And this brought him to the concept of universality, because what is a law? A law is something that applies equally to everyone and in all circumstances. And so finally, it is the law then that reveals to us whether we're acting from inclination or we're acting in accordance or from duty. And what this law was that I must always act such that my maxim, and remember the maxim is the principle of action, so I must always such that my maxim can be willed to be a universal law, right? And then he tested this. Remember, we talked about the concept of under duress, can I make a false promise? And he said no, because if you were to will false promises to be a universal law, then what you're willing is really the end of truthful communication at all, right? Because the whole point of promises is to assert the truth when you have motivation to act otherwise. That's what a promise is. It's an insurance against acting otherwise when you have a motive to act otherwise. So that's where we left off at the end of the last lecture. And that was the first part, right? In the second part, he's going to get more technical, right? Because he's going to do the transition from popular moral philosophy to a metaphysics of morals. That's what he's after. And so he starts here. The margin number is 406, and the page number in our book is 19. And we'll start at the very beginning of the second section. He says, if we have so far drawn our concept of duty from the ordinary use of our practical reason, one is by no means to infer that we have treated it as a concept of experience. On the contrary, when we pay attention to our experience of the way human beings act, we meet frequent, as we ourselves admit, justified complaints that there cannot be cited a single certain example of the disposition to act from pure duty. We meet complaints that although much may be done that is in accordance with what duty commands, yet there are always doubts as to whether what occurs has really been done from duty and so has moral worth. Hence, There have always been philosophers who have absolutely denied the reality of this disposition in human actions and have ascribed everything to a more or less refined self-love. So we may have thought that we got beyond the problem in the first section, but what he's telling us in the second section is that we haven't, that we are still kind of stuck in this mode of not knowing whether we're acting from duty or whether we're acting from inclination. Right? And he says there at the bottom of page 19, this is the margin note, page 407, we like to flatter ourselves with the false claim to a more noble motive, but in fact we can never, even by the strictest examination, completely plumb the depths of the secret incentives of our actions. For when moral value is being considered, the concern is not with the actions which are seen, but rather with their inner principles which are not seen. Right? So we have a problem of duplicity. Right? We have a problem of duplicity. And we might ask, what's the big deal about this? Right? What's the big deal about this? And if we go to the bottom of the next paragraph, which is over on margin page 408, book page 20, he says, consequently, so this is a kind of a conclusion to his point. Consequently, reason unrelentingly commands actions of which the world has perhaps hitherto never provided an example, and whose feasibility might well be doubted by one who bases everything on experience. For instance, even though there might never yet have been a sincere friend, still pure sincerity in friendship is nonetheless required of every man, because this duty, prior to all experience, is contained as duty in general in the idea of a reason that determines the will by means of a priori grounds. And so remember back in the first lecture, I think, and then we talked a little bit last time, we were talking about how Kant is going to give us a moral system that's more like a mathematics, that's true in an a priori sense, that's true prior to, and that's ontologically prior, not temporally prior, but prior to and apart from our experience of the world. He's going to give us a moral system that is going to work. That is his intention, right? He says of morality, and this is in the next paragraph, that it must hold not merely for men, but for all rational beings generally, and it must be valid not merely under contingent conditions and with exceptions, but must be absolutely necessary. So he's going to ground his metaphysics in the rational nature as such. And so we might think of this as the world of human beings. Kant had in mind certainly the world of human beings. He may have also had in mind the world of spiritual beings, so and angelic beings and the like, right? And he asks the question at the end of that paragraph then, and how could laws for the determination of our will be regarded as laws for the determination of a rational being in general and of ourselves only insofar as we are rational beings, if these laws were merely empirical and did not have their source completely a priori in pure but practical reason? Right? So in the prior chapter, we talked about the importance of universality, and we're getting that a little bit here. For something to be truly universal, for something to be truly universal, then it's going to have to be a priori, right? Because it's going to have to apply to circumstances which do not exist and circumstances which we might not be thinking of, right? because something that is universally true is going to work for all circumstances, and this is necessary for the a priori truth of what we're trying to get at, right? Okay, we're going to skip ahead a few pages. He talks a little bit about this problem. And then we're going to go to the bottom of the book, page 22. This is the margin, page number 411. Kind of at the bottom here, it says, "It is clear from the foregoing that all moral concepts have their seat and origin completely a priori in reason." Right? And indeed, the most ordinary human reason, just as much as in the most highly speculative, they cannot be abstracted from any empirical and hence merely contingent cognition. In this purity of their origin lies their very worthiness to serve us as the supreme practical principles, and to the extent that something empirical is added to them, just so much is taken away from their genuine influence and from the absolute worth of the corresponding actions. Right? So this is important. For Kant, the consequences of your actions are not what's important. The consequences of your actions are not what determines the moral worth of your actions. What determines the moral worth of your actions is a priori reasoning. So this is reasoning that is true apart from and separate from anything that happens in the physical world. This is non-empirical. Right? This doesn't depend upon our experience. This is a very critical point for Kant. And why did he want to do this? Well, this is the only thing that puts morality on a sure foundation. But what else is like this? Well, the goodwill is like this. Remember, the goodwill is good in itself and not in reference to anything else, right? What the goodwill desires is good because the goodwill desires it, not because of what it is in itself, right? The goodwill is not subordinated. Okay. At the bottom of the next page, right, this is 23, book page 412, margin page, he talks about the necessity of working according to laws, because he's trying to get past empirical science to pure practical reason. So let's take a look at that last paragraph. He says, "Everything in nature works according to laws. Only a rational being has the power to act according to his conception of laws, that is, according to principles, and thereby has he a will." Right? This is important, that the rational creature has a will because he's able to act according to his conception of laws. This is what a will is. It's the ability to act according to your own concept of the law. So if you're acting according to something else, according to some inclination, right? Hunger or desire or tiredness or whatever, lust for power, you're not acting according to your concept of the law, right? So you have a will because you're able to act according to your concept of the law. That's what it is to have a will. It's to be able to do that. And this is different than what we normally think of, right? We normally think of the will as being something like self-consciousness, that I have a will because I experience myself as a unity or something like that. But this is not it. Kant is distinguishing having a will with being able to act according to a concept of law. This distinguishes us from things like dogs. right? Dogs may or may not have consciousness, but we know that they don't act according to their concept of law, right? They act in accordance with inclination, even when they're being obedient. When they're being obedient, they're inclined to please their master, but that's still acting in accordance with inclination, not according to the concept of law, right? Because the obedience is different depending upon who the master is, right? Or what the action is. Let's continue. If reason infallibly determines the will, then in the case of such a being, actions which are recognized to be objectively necessary are also subjectively necessary, right? If reason infallibly determines the will, right, and the will is the ability to act in accordance with your concept of the law, then those actions are both objectively necessary because they're determined by reason, and subjectively necessary because they're determined by your will, right? It says that is, the will is a faculty of choosing only that which reason, independently of inclination, recognizes as being practically necessary, that is, as good. But if reason of itself does not sufficiently determine the will, right, and will submits also to subjective conditions, right, certain incentives which do not always agree with objective conditions. In a word, if the will does not in itself completely accord with reason, right, as is actually the case with men, right? That's true. The will does not accord with reason completely with human beings, right? This is why we have evil things that happen in the world. This is why we fall short. This is why we can decide ahead of time that we're going to have only one piece of cake after dinner, and then we end up eating two, because our will is not sufficiently determined by reason, right? He says, so this is actually the case with man. He says, then actions which are recognized as objectively necessary are subjectively contingent, and the determination of such a will according to objective laws is necessitation. That is to say, that the relation of objective laws to a will not thoroughly good is represented as the determination of a will of a rational being, but by principles of reason which the will does not necessarily follow because of its own nature. Are you following? Okay, I hope you are. Because what is he talking about here? He says sometimes the will is involved in a contradiction, right? And this is going to be something like the contradiction of the will, right? This is going to be kind of what the definition of evil is. And the will that's in accord with itself is going to be kind of like what the definition of morally good is, right? So he says then, and this is on page 24 in the book, 413, in the margin numbers, he says, the representation of an objective principle insofar as it necessitates the will is called a command of reason. And the formula of the command is called an imperative, right? So the representation of an objective principle insofar as it necessitates the will is called a command of reason. And this is called an imperative. Okay? That's what an imperative is. That's the definition that he's trying to get you to now, right? And then he says, he continues, all imperatives are expressed by an ought, and thereby indicate a relation of an objective law of reason to will that is not necessarily determined by this law because of its subjective constitution. Right? Okay. And then he talks about imperatives commanding either hypothetically or categorically. And he says at the end of in that discussion, he says, now if an action would be good merely as a means to something else, so the imperative is hypothetical, right? If the action is good as a means to something else, then it is hypothetical. What do we know already? Well, he's not interested in the hypothetical, right? Because the hypothetical is empirically oriented, right? He wants something that is a priori true, right? And then right very near the margin number 415, he's got a short paragraph there that illustrates some important points. He says a hypothetical imperative thus says only that an action is good for some purpose, either possible or actual. In the first case, it is a problematic practical principle. In the second case, it is an esoteric one. A categorical imperative, right, which declares an action to be of itself objectively necessary without reference to any purpose, that is, without any other end, holds an apodictic practical principle. Right? And this is what we're after. We're after a categorical imperative. If we have a categorical imperative, then we know that this is the determination of the goodwill. All right, so we're going to skip forward to, I think we're going to skip forward a couple of pages, right? I just want to make a note that on page 27, which is page 417 in the margin numbers, he asked the question about how imperatives are possible. This is not really germane to our discussion of morality, but is germane to Kant's larger project in philosophy. So he's asking about the transcendence there, but we're not going to get into that because we don't have the time. Right? What we want to do is we want to get to the categorical imperative. Right? So I think we're going to skip through our discussion of the next couple of pages. It is important that you read them. Right? It's important that you read them. But we want to get to his conclusion, and that is on page 30 of our book. It's page 421 in the margin note. Right? He's going to talk about what the categorical imperative there is. And he says there, hence, there is only one categorical imperative, and it is this. And this is going to sound very familiar to what we read in the first section, right? But he's getting there a different way. He's getting there a different way. And he says, act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So this is the categorical imperative. If you can only remember one thing about Kant 10 or 20 years from now, what you should remember is that Kant's categorical imperative is act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. That's the categorical imperative. Right? And that's Kant in one sentence. Right? This is a categorical imperative that focuses on the universality of morality. Right? And remember, in the first lecture, we talked about how Kant's moral theory kind of coalesced around three principles. Right? The first one was universality. The second one was dignity. And the third one was autonomy. And this categorical imperative is the expression of universality. Okay? And then he gives some examples to test the categorical imperative, right? And let's take a look at the first of those. It's on page 30 in the text, or 422 in the margin numbers there. It says, a man reduced to despair by a series of misfortunes feels sick of life, but is still so far in possession of his reason that he can ask himself whether taking his own life would not be contrary to his duty to himself. He's contemplating suicide. It's Hamlet. Right? Now he asks whether the maxim of his actions could become a universal law of nature. Right? He asks this and he's going to apply his practical reason to this question. Can it be universalized? Now he asks whether the maxim of his action should become a universal law of nature, but this maxim is this, right? This is his principle. From self-love, I make as my principle to shorten my life when its continued duration threatens more evil than promises satisfaction. Right? There remains only the question as to whether this principle of self-love can become a universal law of nature. One sees at once a contradiction in a system of nature whose law would destroy life by means of the very same feeling that acts so as to stimulate the furtherance of life. So dissatisfaction with life is supposed to stimulate us to pursue satisfaction with life. We experience states of dissatisfaction with life all the time. Most of them are very minor, right? We are dissatisfied being awake, so we go to sleep and get our body the rest that we need. We are dissatisfied with being hungry, so that we eat food and we are nourished. We're dissatisfied with our thirst, so we drink water and our thirst is quenched, right? Being dissatisfied is supposed to be the feeling that motivates you to satisfaction. So we have to be really careful if we're going to universalize something about that feeling of dissatisfaction that's going to lead to the opposite result, right? So Kant says one sees at once a contradiction in the system of nature whose law would destroy life by the means of the very same feeling that the acts so as to stimulate the furtherance of life, and hence there could be no existence as a system of nature. Therefore, such a maxim cannot possibly hold as a universal law of nature, and is consequently wholly opposed to the supreme principle of all duty, because it involves a contradiction. Right? Suicide is immoral because it involves a contradiction. That's why it's immoral. Right? We're not talking about results here. Now, there are a lot of ethical philosophers who would talk about the immorality of suicide by talking about results. They would talk about how it leads to a decrease in general happiness. They would talk about the suffering of those left behind in their grief, right? They would talk about all of the things that the person who killed themselves are going to miss out on, all the joys that they are now not receiving. But that's not what Kant talks about. Kant talks about suicide as involving a rational contradiction. And this is the brilliance of Kant's system, because morality starts to sound like math. And if morality starts to sound like math, then Kant is achieving his objective of giving you a moral system that's a priori. Okay? So that's the first example. I would encourage you to read through example 2 and example 3 that he gives to illustrate what the categorical imperative is. Right? But we will go on. Right? We will go on. On page 427, he says, and this is the margin number 427, it's book page number 34. He says, therefore the question is this: is it a necessary law for all rational beings always to judge their actions according to such maxims as they themselves will at such time serve as a universal law, if there is such a law, that it must already be connected completely a priori with the concept of the will of a rational being in general, right? The law must already be there, right? Because it's prior to experience, right? He says, if there is such a law, then it must already be connected completely a priori with the concept of the will of a rational being in general. But in order to discover this connection, we must, however reluctantly, take a step into metaphysics, although into a region of it different from speculative philosophy. Right? So we're going to take a step into a more of a metaphysical arena to see if we can discover the categorical imperative already there. Okay? So let's look on page, it's our page 35. It's still book page 427, right? He's going to say the will is thought of as a faculty of determining itself to action in accordance with the representation of certain laws. And such a faculty can be found only in rational beings. Right? Only rational beings have a will, and the will is a faculty of determining itself in action according to rational laws, right? So these two things, they're going to go together. They're going to go together, right? And you have to really follow the reasoning here. So we're going to read the detail. It says, now, what serves the will as an objective ground of its self-determination is an end. Right? What serves the will as an objective ground of its self-determination is an end. So the end is what serves the will as its self-determination. Does that make sense? Right? Right? Self-determination is what serves the will. Then he continues, and if this end is given by reason alone, then it must be equally valid for all rational beings. Right? So, will is a faculty of determining action in accordance with certain laws, right? And this faculty can only be found in rational beings, right? Because only rational beings can know the law, right? And what serves the will as an objective ground of its self-determination is an end, right? And this end is given by reason alone, and it's equally valid for all rational beings. Okay, so a rational being can serve the end of the good will, the thing that's good in itself, and nothing else can. Okay, let's continue, right? All of the words are important in this section. Right? The subjective ground of desire is the incentive, but the objective ground of volition is the motive. Hence, there arises the distinction between subjective ends, which rest on incentives, right? And that is subjectivity, and objective ends, which depend on motives valid for every rational being, right? That is objectivity in the rational being. He says practical principles are formal when they abstract from all subjective ends. They are material, however, when they are founded upon subjective ends and hence upon certain incentives. The ends which a rational being arbitrarily proposes to himself and effects of this action, material ends, are merely relative, right? They're subjective and they're material and they're relative, and we're not really interested in those, right? Because they're contingent. They exist as ends that are means to other things, right? They are not ends in themselves, they are means to other ends, right? For if the relation to a specially constituted faculty of desire in the subject gives them their worth, right? So it's a desire in the subject that gives them their worth. Consequently, such worth cannot provide any universal principles because it's not universal. It's particular to that circumstance, right? So therefore, all relative ends can be grounds only for hypothetical imperative. So the relative end is the ground only for the hypothetical imperative, not the categorical imperative. Right? So now we're on margin page 28, or sorry, margin page 428. And the argument is going to kind of move up a notch, right? He says, but let us suppose that there was something whose existence has itself an absolute worth. Right? There is something whose existence has in itself an absolute worth. What does it mean to have absolute worth? It means not being dependent upon experience or not being subject to contingency, right? It's absolute. So let's suppose there was something whose existence has absolute worth, something which, as an end in itself, could be a ground of determinate laws. In it and it alone would there be the ground of a possible categorical imperative, that is, of the practical law. Right? What is it that has absolute worth? Well, it's the rational being that has absolute worth. Why does the rational being have absolute worth? Well, because its self-determination is determined by the universal law, right? And if it's determined by the universal law, then it has worth in and of itself. It has worth absolutely, right? So he continues, and this is still on page 428. He's talking about the rational being. He must, in all his actions, whether directed to himself or to other rational beings, always be regarded at the same time as an end. All objects of inclinations have only a conditioned value. For if these were not inclinations, and the needs founded on them, then their object would be without value, but inclinations themselves, being the sources of needs, are so far from having absolute value, such as to render them desirable for their own sake, blah, 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 blah. Then he continues the couple sentences down, but whose existence depends not on our will, but on nature, have, nevertheless, if they are not rational beings, only relative value as means, and are therefore called things. On the other hand, rational beings are called persons. Rational beings are called persons, inasmuch as their nature already marks them out as ends in themselves, that is, as something which is not to be used merely as means, and hence there is imposed thereby a limit on all arbitrary use of such things. Right? And the next paragraph down, kind of right where it says 429 in the margin, there's a sense the ground of such principle is this: rational nature exists as an end in itself. And then later down in that paragraph, the last sentence of that paragraph, he says, the practical imperative will therefore be the following: act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, always at the same time as an end and never simply as a means. So this is his second great principle, right? This is the practical imperative. And so remember, I told you that there's three themes in Kant: universality, dignity, and autonomy. This is the dignity theme. So universality is the categorical imperative. Right? Act always such that you can will to universalize your maxim. And dignity is this practical imperative. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, always at the same time as an end and never simply as a means. Well, what does this do for us? Well, this is a very radical equality between human beings. If we read more of Aristotle, we would find that Aristotle wrote extensively on the subject of slavery. And one of the things that he didn't have a problem with was slavery. He thought that there were some human beings that were born to be owners of slaves, and there were some human beings that were born to be owned by other people. This kind of difference doesn't square well with Kantian ethics. Kantian deontology tells us that every human being, as a rational creature, has absolute worth and can never be treated as a means only, but also must be treated as a means, as an end in himself. Well, this eliminates the possibility of having another person as property. Because if you own another person, what you're saying is that they are a means to your end only, and not an end in themselves. So this is something new in philosophy. This is really, really radical. And this is at the same time it's radical, and at the same time it's amazing, it's the mathematization, really, of ethics. Why cannot we have slavery? Well, because to have slaves would involve a logical contradiction, because the rational nature is an end in itself. And if something is an end in itself, you cannot subordinate that completely to another end, or to a foreign end, or to a contingent end. Right? So this really comes down to us as the principle of human dignity. And that is a very, very important principle. We are not yet through the second section, but I do want to end here for tonight, because really there are three themes in Kant, right? And those are equality, or universality, dignity, and autonomy. And we've got to two of them. The third one is going to be developed in the next couple of pages. That is autonomy. And he's going to talk about the self-legislating being. And I think that it would be better to end this lecture now and then start one more lecture on Kant that's going to kind of cover the self-legislating being and then kind of wrap up the rest of the text. We are a little bit behind this week. I don't anticipate that lecture is going to get up until Saturday. So I do apologize about that. I do hope that you're able to get these first three lectures watched and listened to by then. We may end up skipping the quiz again this week, just like we did last week, because we're behind. I will have the midterms grades posted soon. But the next exam is coming relatively soon, and we might just skip the quizzes now and focus on getting the material this week and next week that you're going to need for that second exam that's going to be on Kant and utilitarianism. All right, so I think that we're at 43 minutes, and we have said a lot of words in this one, and I think it's best to end this now. Expect another lecture on Saturday, wrapping up Kant, and then probably another lecture on Sunday. We're going to be discussing Jeremy Bentham.